CBS News White House and senior foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan joins me now for a closer look at the vice president's trip. So, Margaret, how much did the president's Jerusalem decision factor into the vice president postponing this visit?
Well, this visit was originally supposed to happen back in mid-December after the president made that Jerusalem decision unilaterally, one that Vice President Pence did support. It was meant to, at the time, be somewhat of a victory lap, something that said we are delivering to voters, particularly those evangelical supporters, on something we campaigned on. However, the White House didn't necessarily expect the kind of blowback they got, including from Christian leaders in the Middle East. This was not only an unpopular decision with Palestinian leadership and Muslim leaders who point out that the disputed territory in Jerusalem includes some Muslim holy sites that they would like Palestinians to have claim to, but this also didn't go over well with Arab leaders who happen to be Christian. And so in Egypt, you had a number of Christian leaders say they wouldn't meet with Vice President Pence. It all added a sense of awkwardness to that scheduled trip. It also happened to coincide with a difficult political calendar, remember, because Vice President Pence was needed here in Washington to help cast a vote to push through some of the president's legislative agenda, then something he once again might have to consider as an influence on his trip, since there's yet another Washington crisis afoot.
Margaret, do you expect, given what you just laid out, the concerns that were expressed about this, that the Jerusalem decision will come up in talks the vice president might have in Egypt and Jordan?
It absolutely will. The vice president, when he goes to Egypt, this will be the first time that you have seen an Arab leader, a Muslim leader embrace and be willing to visit with the American leadership. So Vice President Pence will surely try to make that a point. It will come up in their conversations as well. But as you know, Egypt has long had a peace treaty with Israel. They have a lot of intelligence sharing. And Egypt, while opposed in principle to making a decision that didn't include Palestinians whatsoever and really disregarded any claims they had to the city of Jerusalem. While they have protested it, they haven't made it in any way a real sticking point with the Americans. They have their own interests in mind, and they haven't been prioritizing that of the Palestinians in a way that would prevent President al-Sisi of Egypt from meeting with Vice President Pence. But where it will be a very awkward conversation is when Vice President Pence meets with the King of Jordan, King Abdullah, because this is once again putting him in a real tight spot. Remember, Jordan has been inundated with Palestinian refugees for decades now. In fact, about 60% of their population or more is Palestinian in origin. And so he not only has to speak to his own constituency at home in voicing their concern that the Palestinian claim, particularly to East Jerusalem, was disregarded here, but also say that as the guardian of the mosques, remember that the King of Jordan also helps to ensure some of the peace there in terms of Muslim claim to the holy sites in that holy city. He'll bring that up as well. So lots to talk about, and you can't ever really go to the Middle East without some political backlash, but this will be quite sharp directly against President Trump, one of President Trump's decisions, one that no other country in the world, up until he declared it, had been willing to do.
And Margaret, you raised the possibility that the possible government shutdown is looming over the vice president's trip, that it could even be postponed again. But what happens if the government shuts down and the vice president is already overseas?
Well, the vice president is supposed to be wheels up around 7 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow. So if he's wheels up before that shutdown, he might be able to at least make it across part of the ocean. But the question here, and what the White House has been poring over some of these rules and regulations, can they continue with a foreign trip? Can even the president take a foreign trip, as he's scheduled to do next week, to Davos, Switzerland, if the government is in a shutdown? The Secretary of State also has a trip scheduled to Europe, and that may be affected if there is a shutdown. So behind the scenes, scenes, you have a lot of White House officials speaking, meeting, making calls on Capitol Hill, trying to get their own caucus in line, trying to get their own Republicans in line. But as one White House official told me, they're real concerned about the Senate. So we may not know until, midnight Friday exactly which direction this is going to go in, but you could very well see a government shutdown on the anniversary of President Trump's first year in office.
Wow, that is remarkable to think about just that possibility. Margaret, I want to go back to the president's Jerusalem decision in December that he would move the embassy in Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Do we have a time frame from the White House about when this might happen?
Well, I know that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been quoted as saying he thinks this is going to happen within the year. But President Trump has said publicly, and the Secretary of State has also said publicly, that this kind of planning is going to take them more like 3 or 4 years, because they actually are talking about building an embassy. Now, remember, the U.S. already has a major diplomatic outpost in Jerusalem. In fact, it's a pretty significant consulate that they use as the main consulate to deal with the Palestinian Authority, which has some self-rule over the West Bank. So there is already a diplomatic presence there. Technically, you could hang a sign outside and say, this is officially our diplomatic outpost, period. But when it comes to building what is technically an embassy, there's all sorts of security considerations. They're talking about building an entirely new building. That does not happen quickly. So the kind of timeline that the Israeli Prime Minister is talking about may be a bit too hopeful on his end.
And Margaret, you traveled with President Trump when he first visited Israel this past May. How different do you expect Vice President Pence's trip to be?
Well, this will once again be a country and leadership that is opening their arms wide to the vice president, because the Israeli government, Benjamin Netanyahu's government, has really gotten much of what they have wanted from this administration. Yes, the prior administration, Israel got the biggest military aid package they'd ever gotten in history, but there are political differences between Netanyahu and Obama. With President Trump, he has really delivered on a lot of the things that he promised to Benjamin Netanyahu. And so while he hasn't gotten the kind of financial support and pledges from Trump that he did from Obama, he's gotten more of the kind of political boost. And trust me, he needs it right now. So Vice President Pence is also doing somewhat of a political favor by visiting Netanyahu right now, who's under investigation in his own country. He's really under political siege in his own country because of these corruption claims against him. He's also been on a lot of pressure to lean farther right. So that's something that you've seen him balancing out a lot. So this is going to be a warm embrace from him to Vice President Pence. You will also see the Vice President go and pray at the Western Wall. That will be an official visit. Past administrations, they've made it unofficial, just to go and pray. But because that wall is shared with a Muslim holy site, but with this administration, they're really trying to make the point that they wholeheartedly support the Israeli claims here. And so Vice President Pence will do that same thing, just like you saw President Trump do, go and pray at the Western Wall.
Finally, Margaret, what is it that the White House wants overall out of this trip?
Well, for the vice president, remember, he is a very religious man. He has made that religious belief of his. You remember, he was Catholic. He became evangelical, a virtue, part of what has been a political platform for him as well. And he wants to continue to emphasize just how important that is, not only to him, but to the Trump base and to Trump supporters. So when the vice president goes to the Holy Land, that is politically symbolic for them. But at the moment, they also need to get that pat on the back from one Arab Muslim leader. They'll get that in Egypt with visiting al-Sisi, and manage some things with King Abdullah in Jordan as well. But remember, Elaine, we don't know if the vice president will actually be able to continue with this trip.
Right.
He may take off. He may have to turn around and come right back if the government does shut down, because it might not look very good for the cameras if the vice president is traveling around the world at a time when the military is not getting paid, and many of the staffers who work for him won't be either.
All right. Busy times in Washington. Margaret Brennan at the White House. Thank you so much.